Okay, I'm really thrilled to be talking to you this morning about language futures. It's been a very intense research project that I've been doing over the last 18 months or so, and I'm going to focus on one particular part of it, which, as Annalise indicated, is going to be the implications for the mainstream classroom. There's lots more that could be said about language futures, and there will be an opportunity to read lots more about it and find out much more about it from other people that are also here at this conference. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a quick introduction into what it is. There'll be some people, no doubt, in the room that haven't heard of it, and then get on and focus on the mainstream implications. So, initially, Language Futures was an initiative that came from Learning Futures, which was it was an approach to learning devised and developed through the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, which was really centred on the deepest possible engagement that learners could have with their learning, the sort of motivation where they will willingly take it beyond the classroom. So we're not talking about homework as much as just wanting to get involved and keep involved and build the learning into their lives. The Language Futures part of it that was developed along those same conceptual lines was initially started by Linton Village College, which is a secondary school in Cambridgeshire, and they started it off in 2009. The five key elements of or core features of Language Futures are these. The idea is that students have a lot of choice, and that empowers them to be more active agents in their learning, so developing learner autonomy. The teacher then becomes the sort of architect of the learning, the sort of holds the overall plan, and then in lesson time is very much the facilitator, isn't an expert in every single language. I'll go on to the actual different language choices in a moment. But very much supports rather than leading a language lesson in a typical way. It's based on project-based learning, so there is a sort of sustained momentum behind things whereby there's an overall project aim and outcome, and students work towards it over several weeks, or it could be a shorter project, or it could be a longer project over a term. This idea of school as base camp is this critical notion of students not seeing the classroom as where they go to get all of their learning, but that it's just a touching base moment, and then they take their learning beyond the classroom, as I said, hopefully willingly. The learning community is about the involvement of other adults and peers in the classroom as part of the learning process. So it's really based on a kind of social constructivist model for seeing learning as not something that's transmitted from one person to the other, but something that is generated out of collaborative experiences in the classroom. So there are mentors, there are adult mentors, there were also sixth form mentors as part of this project, but also the learners learn from each other as well in small groups and pairs. So all of these core features are built-in essential concepts as part of the Language Futures programme. The particular research study that I did was a longitudinal study, so it's been going over the last 18 months and took in a kind of academic year of progress. There are 4 different models of language features. It didn't start off, the research design didn't start off like this, but when it came down to looking at how to get underneath the skin of what was going on, there were clearly 4 different models, 4 very different models of language features in operation. And so I grouped the 8 schools into those 4 different models that I identified. And that's quite important in terms of what we've discovered about language futures. The 4 models, I'll just briefly explain those because that's kind of quite important to what we go on and say. Language futures was in use in some schools as an in-curriculum model, so they did it in the learning day, within the learning day, as a second foreign language. So students were still learning their first foreign language, and instead of picking up, let's say, for example, they all learnt French, and then in a particular year, year 8 or year 9, they were given the opportunity to learn a second foreign language. They either had the choice of learning that second foreign language, Spanish, in a normal classroom situation, just as they'd been learning French, or they could choose to learn a second foreign language within a Language Futures programme, which was designed so that they could choose a language of their choice, any language, as long as they could find a mentor for it, as long as a mentor from the community could be sourced as a native speaker or a near native speaker to help them, and if there were at least 2 students that wanted to do that language. Because previous research on this model had shown that those were kind of 2 critical factors to help students make progress. So in this model, there were students who had chosen to just do Spanish in a normal classroom, but there were 2 classes of learners, so 43 students, and they were from the top sets because those were the ones that were going to get to learn the second foreign language anyway. They were learning Language Futures with 7 different languages going on in one classroom. So that's model 1. Model 2 was an in-curriculum model for heritage language, community language learning. So quite often schools we try to support heritage community language accreditation, but very rarely do we give curriculum time over to students embedding and developing their literacy in their home language. And we all know that when students come over here, depending on what time they come in their education, they may speak that language at home, but they may not end up being literate in that language, and then it makes it very difficult for them to accredit. So in this particular model, you had Polish students, for example, who at some point had come over to live in the UK, and they were all at different levels of acquisition and expertise in their language, in their native language. It becomes even difficult to talk about what is their mother tongue, and that was really interesting. And I'll come back to that later, the importance of this programme for developing and sustaining their contact with their mother tongue and with their heritage language. So that's model 2. Model 3 was Key Stage 3 in curriculum again, but this was for very different learners. This was for learners who have been switched off, disengaged, had lost the pace of learning within a larger class of 30, had not asked the questions that they needed to have asked, had not been able to make the progress at the pace that it was being made at, and had become very disenchanted with the whole idea of language learning as a result. And this was an alternative provision for them. Again, an important model, very, very different from the other 2. And the final one was Language Futures as extracurricular, so essentially as a language club that students opted to do after school. And again, it ran along the lines of you can choose your language as long as we can find you a mentor, and as long as you've got 2 students that want to do the language at least, then you can do that. And it ran typically for 1 hour a week after school time. So those different models, as you can already see, are bound to yield very different results in terms of learning and very different things. And so that's why I divided them in that way. Okay, and this is the menu. Don't worry, this is not what we're going to talk about. This is what the report contents page looks like. And any of you that are interested and inspired enough to go and get the whole report, it is ready. You might want to read some of the other parts of it. We're actually going to focus on this bit here. So we're going to look at the mainstream language learning classroom and what messages there are for us, what we can take on board potentially that resonate with us in the classrooms that we more usually teach in. Okay, so motivation was an absolutely pivotal theme in this study. And motivation is something that is very current and something that we're talking a lot about, motivation for language learning in this country at the moment. We know that A-level take-up is challenging. We know that Key Stage 4 take-up is not where it needs to be. We know that the gap between what the government stated aims for language learning at Key Stage 4 are and what the actual situation on the ground is, we know that that gap is unbelievably wide, such that it makes a mockery even of saying that by 2022, 75% of students will be taking a GCSE language. By 2025, 90% of all 16-year-olds in this country will be taking a GCSE in a language. I'm not going to test your positivity by getting you to put your hands up if you think that's going to happen. I'm hoping it will happen, but I think we might need to move the timeline a little bit. We know that motivation is a tricky one. Of the students who are not getting the EBacc, and there are lots of those, 80% of the reason why the students are not getting the EBacc is the language they're not doing. They're not taking up the language. And that's fairly significant finding. So we know that motivation is really key. However, there's been a lot of research done on motivation and all of the different things. What point is there in learning a language? English is the lingua franca, those sort of messages that filter through into the classroom. And I'm not going to deny that those are there and that those do play a part. But actually, the most important factor in this country for students in learning a language is their experience in the classroom itself. There's no doubt about that. We are the ones that make the biggest difference. And that's both exciting and empowering and a big responsibility. But when we identify possible ways to improve the motivation in our classrooms, and hopefully you'll see that there are some suggested ways here that we could tweak certain things that we do, I think those are opportunities that we must take up. There is an imperative there. This study finds that aspects of autonomy, students driving their own learning, students making choices about what they do in their learning, together with project-based learning, are very strongly aligned with positive motivation and motivational change. So students who've come in not being that motivated and then having this type of thing to do have become much more motivated, and that is important. There are strong messages about mentor support, about the influence that having other adults or older learners in your classroom alongside your students. There are messages about how that can work both extremely well and also not that well. And I think we need to look at those, because there are cost-effective ways. With so many of us not being able to afford FLAs anymore, we kind of need to think outside the box about, well, how do we get mentors then into the classroom? How do we get additional people involved in the learning? Because we know that we have, even in set classes, a massively wide range of ability. And we might need to face the fact that however good we are at differentiation, we're not necessarily able to meet all of the needs of all of the learners all of the time. So what additional help and support could other older students provide, or adults from the community? So this has a lot to say about that. Huge levels of anxiety in the modern languages classroom. That's not a new phenomenon. It didn't take my research to uncover that. There are a zillion links that we could all follow up about how language learning is the subject that instigates the most anxiety in learners. How do we mitigate that? What are the different ways we can have? We're going to have a look at that as well. Overall, one more overwhelming message from this study was that individual differences are absolutely key, and no innovation can satisfy the needs of all your learners, just like no one teaching approach can be the right teaching approach for every single learner. And I'm really wary of any messages that come out to us that tell us that the right method for teaching languages has suddenly been discovered. Let's all do that one. Because that's probably the most ridiculous thing that you're ever likely to hear. We've got to accept that we're all individual as teachers. We can't just take on board someone else's teaching methodology and own that. But also, and more importantly, the pupils in front of us are so absolutely different from each other that we need to not assume that one thing will fit all. I'm going to give you the caveat now that research is important and powerful, but it is not something where you can, we're all busy teachers, so what we want is something where we're going to have some really quick answers, where, oh yes, if you can just do this, 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 and this, it'll all be great. We cannot have prescription from research. On the other hand, if research tells us nothing as teachers, what is the point of research? There is a pedagogical imperative for research. It's got to be useful, as far as I'm concerned. Otherwise, there's no point to it. So hopefully this will be useful, but please don't confuse it with, right, that's the black and white list of things to do, because it's not as good as that. So, motivational power of choice. I've lifted little statements from the report. All of these have been found through a complete mixture of student interviews, teacher interviews, mentor interviews, classroom observations, classroom documents, a whole wealth of stuff, huge amounts of stuff, so much data that at one point earlier on in this year I thought I was going to go under with the amount of data that there was to analyse. But some of the statements that are going to come out, you're going to think, well, yeah, don't teach me to suck eggs. But at the same time, is it not comforting that there's been a lot of investigation that has yielded things that we kind of know instinctively? I think sometimes we do have to back up the things that we instinctively feel to be true with actual data and with actual evidence. Motivational power of choice. Okay, so we might be thinking, well, actually it's not realistic for me to just say to the whole of Year 7, do you know what language would you like to learn? Okay, a few of you want to do Chinese, you want to do Japanese, marvellous. You want to do Italian, you want to do Tagalog, brilliant. I'll find some adults, we'll get them all in. We can't whole scale change the nature of what we do, nor is that the point of this programme. This was never about changing the way languages are taught to that degree. What we need to be thinking is, do we give as much choice as we absolutely can in the classroom? If we know that choice is motivating, do we use every opportunity to give that choice when we can? Because I know that I don't, and I know that having written this, I've then taken notes on board and have given just simply a few more choices in things. So they may just be learning French in your classroom, but where could they have choice? So, choice of words to learn, or do we set the words? Or do we do both? I mean, some of these will be things that everybody will be thinking, oh, well, I do that, and that's great. This is as much to remind us of key messages that might have fallen off people's radar as it is to change your world, rock your world. So choice of words to learn, I don't always do that. Maybe always isn't good, but I actually don't often do that. I think I've been very prescriptive over the last couple of years because we've been desperate to embed regular vocabulary learning at all costs and have a system that works for all of us in all of our schools. When can choice be given? When is it useful to have a choice of words? I've done more of these. These are out there. They're ubiquitous on the internet, on the TES, all of those Nando's, chili peppers with the different things. But again, that slips off people's radars, and they think, oh, well, actually, what homework shall I set? You're very, very busy. You get a worksheet, you shove it up there, and you say, right, that's your homework. Can we build in more variety in terms of how students demonstrate their learning outside the classroom? Can we give them the challenge of showing me what you've learned over the last 2 weeks in any form you like? You demonstrate to me what you've learned over the last 2 weeks. That gave some interesting tasks actually when I did that earlier on this year. Do we do this as well as we could? Strategy training and actual class time, significant in-curriculum class time for memorising words and keeping them in. I'm sure we all do this to a certain extent. We might sort of call on children that are doing particularly well in vocabulary tests and say to them, oh, do you know what? How is it that you keep getting 18 out of 20 or 19 out of 20 or 20 out of 20? What are your methods? And share those with the pupils. But do we actually give over class time for them to practice those methods and then choose the method that's best for them? I have a colleague in my department who's at this table who's doing some excellent work exactly about that at the moment. And it is very powerful. In order to do it, we need to thin out our schemes of work. And that's another thing that I think this research is telling me we need to do, and do big time. And stop having this pace to move on and cover and finish a whole book or whatever. We need to take a step back from that and cut things out and look at what has to be mastered. Because it's not satisfying to any learner of any ability to move on before they've mastered something, or to not feel confident that the teacher's going to take them back time and time again. If you're going to recycle reliably time and time again, brilliant, then reassure your learners that you're going to do that. But I'm not sure that that's currently as embedded as it could be. This is another sort of moment for choice. The 80-20 rule in writing from the very, very beginning, such that you don't get a kind of mishmash of stuff from learners. You get 80% is based on what you've taught them and you know they've practiced it and it's got all of the structures in it that you know are going to be great for them in 5 years' time when they do their GCSE. But 20% is for the individual development of personal repertoire so that they experiment with some things. You do let them Google Translate for 20%. Not necessarily Google Translate, but you're not going to be worried about them trying to tell you that they love scuba diving when scuba diving was not on your list of vocab to be teaching them this week. There must be an opportunity for them to develop personal expression, and when they go wrong with it, because it hasn't been a structure that you've actually introduced with them, you can correct it for that one child and then say, build this into your personal repertoire. And that needs to be a sort of thing that keeps going on and on and on throughout, from year 7 to year 11. They're not going to change their personalities all that much in that time. They're still going to be musical. If they're musical in year 7, they'll still be musical in year 11. So building that personal means of self-expression has got to be vital. So just a few messages there. Open-ended classroom tasks. You know, we all feel that we're on a bit of a rush to do things. So if you're thinking, well, I need to teach que hay en la ciudad, I'm going to teach places in the town. The classic thing would be to use the textbook. Oh yes, and there is that module. It's on my scheme of work. I see it's on page 84, Viva 1, or whatever it is. Don't quote me on that. I made up page 84 because I don't know the whole of the book. But those nouns are predetermined. They're on the page on the left-hand side. And those are the exact nouns that you have to do. And there's something about, well, here are the answers. There's something that sometimes is a little bit too provided, too upfront. And textbooks are absolutely brilliant and absolutely necessary, but sometimes you can move away from one and think, what is the learning point of this lesson? The learning point of this lesson is really about the indefinite article, and how to vary your indefinite article and how to really be aware of gender. It doesn't matter whether polideportivo is actually a word that you've included in this lesson, because that could come in later. So sometimes when you back off from the words, the vocabulary, and you look at the grammatical content, you can open up your lesson to something a little bit more open-ended. So if your core objective is that, to learn some nouns for places you could see, some nouns, not a specific set of 12, but any nouns, and learning to use and some correctly, you could then, could you not, just find a clip of a city, one of those tourist clips that comes on YouTube, play it for 2 minutes, get them to write down everything they've seen, because those will be different answers then, because they will all see different things in the video, because there'll be things that their eyes are light on because they're really interested in mechanical stuff like cranes. When you do this lesson, you might want to watch the video carefully first, and because they'll ask you, "Cómo se dice crane?" And I had to work quite hard to remember that one. But then, of course, you give them diccionarios, so that's okay, and you use the line, "I'm not a walking dictionary." And it's but actually after that, it was a different sort of a buzz than me showing them a picture of un cine and them saying un cine with me, which is also fine. But actually, it was quite open-ended. And after watching it, we then hit the dictionaries, we looked up the words, and if you look at the little scan of this dictionary, you'll see that it's listed with the definite article. I'm not sure I love this dictionary design, but these are the ones we have anyway. And they needed to then make those changes. They needed to decide whether they'd seen one river or several, one crane or several, and they needed to make the decisions. They were responding to the content of their own lists in order to decide. So the link between language and meaning was just a little bit closer to them in this particular lesson than it would have been in a textbook. And I think that message has also come through. How open-ended can we be with our tasks? Okay. Language mentors. The study found that when you have got other learners, other adults in the classroom or sixth formers or older learners, the learning is incredibly and invaluably enhanced. It also showed that the personality and the attitude and the way that that mentor interacts with students is absolutely crucial, and it's very possible to get it wrong and turn certain learners off. So, there's a cautionary note there. But if we're thinking, well, that's great, but how do I get all these people into my classroom? I'm not going to say that you can just click your heels together 3 times and they're there and it's all marvellous. But it is possible to do, and there are some suggestions about how we could do it in schools, and these are not off the top of my head suggestions. These are suggestions that I know are actually working in schools that I'm active in. So sixth form enrichment, in which students use their enrichment afternoon. This is if you've got a sixth form or a nearby sixth form. They use their enrichment afternoon in order to support on that particular Wednesday afternoon in classes. And this one is absolutely amazing. She has introduced the most amazing programme into our school this year, where sixth form students are teaching some of the year 7s who've come to us with no prior Spanish, so they feel a little bit behind, and they have chosen to attend, these pupils have chosen to attend, and the sixth formers plan, deliver, monitor, assess the learning. They are entirely responsible for these little mini classes themselves. So there are perhaps 6 or 7 students in different classrooms after school who have 4 or 5 students coming to their class, and their progress is absolutely phenomenal. So this is in addition to what's going on in the classroom. It's really helped them catch up. It's really helped them with that whole role modelling, because they can see that someone who's relatively close in age, still in the same establishment, and how good they are at Spanish, not being native speakers, not being specially different, just doing A-level, how they can relate that to you, to them. We've also had this, I'm going to speed up now, adult community volunteers who come into lessons once a week to classes of year 7 and 8. This is one that I want to see more of. We've done it from time to time. It's worked incredibly well. We need to do more of it and more systematically. You don't need to pay for the DRB. That's what we're calling it these days, isn't it? What is it? DBS. What? DBS. Yeah. Too many acronyms. They change the name of that thing every 5 seconds. But you don't have to pay for it if they are volunteers. And so, yes, it does have to be done, and a little bit of admin time from your HR person has to happen. But that is no cost as such. There's a cost in time. And then you obviously do want to liaise with them. And I would interview them, and I would watch them work and give them a trial. I know it's just for a voluntary position, but people who've done that with us have then used me as a referee for all sorts of jobs that they've been. So I feel that I've given something back because they have then gone on to do particular things that they've wanted to do. We've had some come and then start language teacher training. We've had some come and then go on and be TAs in local primary schools. And so there is a real local community build-up from this. Adult learners in lessons is something I can recommend hugely highly. Hugely highly? That sounds dire, sorry. I can really recommend it. It is the most powerful thing in the world to have learning with you. So imagine you've got a year 10 class starting out in September and you recruit people who've happen to be able to fit in the times to come to your 3 lessons each week with your year 10 class. They come in and they learn as learners. They submit their homework. They put their hands up. They ask questions. When I tried this out, I tried it with really demotivated students when I was doing an MVQ. Behaviour issues, I didn't have any, with 3 adults in the room as well. They just set such a powerful model that I knew it was mostly them rather than me that was carrying the burden of that behaviour management. And even for that alone, it's great. But just giving very valuable modelling for what sorts of questions could be asked about this topic. All the adults have always got loads of questions to ask you about what you're presenting, and you suddenly realise, oh my goodness, why haven't the students for the last 5 years been asking this many questions? And that's very, very important. Right, autonomy. There is a big connection between the opportunities to be in charge of what you do and your feeling of satisfaction at doing it. This resonates with absolutely every finding in terms of psychological needs for self-determination much more generally. So not about language learning specifically. There's a big body of research out there on self-determination theory and the importance of being able to be autonomous in what you do for achieving a closer connection to it. There's just a little dialogue for you to read through. You've got about a second to read through that, so off you go. I've got to move on really fast now. Okay, so students being a lot more interactive and saying actually from this project that they took their curiosity and their question asking back into other subjects as well, not just their other language learning, but science and maths and whatever. They just found that they were just more likely to think of questions to ask and to ask those questions after having been involved in this kind of project. I also talked to students then about what they felt would be the ideal model for a classroom-based language. If it's all one language, if it's all Spanish, what would be the ideal model? Because a lot of students saw value in a teacher telling them things. They didn't all just want to go, all right, I'm on my own, that's it now, I can just learn by myself, I don't want my teacher. There was a real awareness that having the teacher there is important. And I asked them about this ideal scenario. And students wanted a mixture. They wanted either teacher-led to start off, and then much more time for them to embed independently and to project work and work in groups. Again, you'll see you need time for that, so you need to thin your curriculum. Or some students actually wanted to do their independent stuff first, find out about things first, and then have a teacher lesson to let them know how well they'd done it. Because what they did sometimes find frustrating in Language Futures is that they might go for 2 or 3 lessons really embedding some knowledge that they had, only to find that it wasn't correct knowledge, because the internet is good, there are lots of resources, but you can go off on a track that's wrong. So they wanted checking, they wanted the teacher, they wanted to do their own stuff, but they then wanted the teacher to come in and to take it on from there. So either one of those 2 approaches could be something that we vary in our normal classrooms. Low retaining students. Hopefully this is going to resonate with things I've said earlier on in the talk. If it isn't, you'll have to read the slides later. Low retaining students overwhelmingly appreciated Language Futures because of the time, because they were given much more time to master much less. And that is a message that I think we can take on board for our mainstream classes. I think I would urge all of us to go back to our schemes of work and really consider carefully. Otherwise, you get to year 11, and you reteach some things that you thought you taught earlier on because they still haven't got those things. But what things are those? Those are verbs like ser, estar, the big five, tener, hacer. If we mastered those earlier on, rather than just meeting them and thinking we'd mastered them, I think we would have a much, much better thing going on. Right, let's move on quickly. Reduce our content, focus on key verbs, give opportunities for extensive practice. The practice and the use bit are the bits that get clipped as we need to move on to the next assessment or we need to move on to the next topic. And we must be systematic, I think, about our revisiting, because the demands on the middle to lower retainers in terms of retention, and we know now that it's not learn, write, forget, like controlled assessment. It's learn, relearn, keep it in your head, add more stuff to it. We need to help them go back and revisit those essentials, otherwise they won't be able to make the progress that we need them to make. Okay, so project-based learning, I've said how motivating it is, and I think we need to just take that on board, consider how we can get some of these core things. These are the things they really liked about project-based learning. Working with the same bunch of language for longer, having a practical outcome and purpose, and having an audience for their work at the end of it. Now, that could be a virtual audience because they could just make an iPad recording of whatever it is, put it up on a Padlet, and other students can then go and listen to it. That doesn't have to be this massive public performance. Culture was very, very motivating, particularly to students at the lower end. So in Model 3 that I was talking about, where Language Futures was an additional. I am really moving fast now. Culture, this is from the National Curriculum Programme Study Statement, Purpose of Study, which I love, but it's not quite got enough on culture. But if you look through the rest of it, this is not quite as developed as it could be about culture, but I think we mustn't forget culture because it's absolutely key to motivation, as I know you know. Developing classroom ecology. This is about how we get students to not be as anxious about asking questions, because I truly believe if you did a little research project on yourself next week or someone else in your department and logged the number of questions that students are asking about the learning, we'd find it's not as many as we quite want. There's quite a lot of, can I go to the toilet? Can I sit next to her? Can you give me a merit? I need a new book, where's my glue stick? But what about sort of, so, if that verb works like that there, would it be such and such in this sentence? That's the sort of questioning that I'm after. There's not a lot of questioning that happens in that way. Asking questions in small groups, the research findings would suggest from this study, is much more face-saving. They will do it much more if they are working in small groups. They have more questions to ask in Language Futures because less is explained to them up front. They just have more questions because we're not presenting it all so much like a done deal. We're not explaining everything right up front in minute detail, and therefore they have questions. And as long as, I think that's good for them to have questions. Let's not be as good as at explaining things as we are, maybe. Let's leave a bit to, let's put some mistakes on the board and see if they notice and ask us questions about them. I don't know. Have I just said make mistakes? No, that's very bad. A teacher in this room that I know does this a lot, Jane Driver does this all the time. It's one of her classic mechanisms when she teaches. Let's not answer questions ourselves. Let's ask another student to answer that question all the time. I've seen other teachers do it. I try and do it myself. But it's really difficult to avoid the temptation to answer a question when you've just asked it. But if your reaction is, oh, and what do you think? And what do you think? And what do you think? You'll get much more in from the students. Actively promote question asking in the target language. Teach them how to do it. Tell them you love it. And they will begin to do it a bit more often, etc. Get them to use these pair mechanisms as well. Final thing, because we need to stop for lunch. How might a Language Futures sequence look in a whole class teaching scenario? So a bit of choice, controlling the pace and the scope of your learning, if you can and whenever you can, whenever we can give students that opportunity, having some open-ended tasks and some longer projects if we can manage, working collaboratively in small groups and pairs as much as possible. And that's where I'm going to leave it, actually, because that was a worked example of how it might look in one lesson, but that will give you the motivation to download the slides at the end of this conference. Thank you very, very much. I'm not going to hold you up from your lunch anymore. I hope you have a fantastic conference. Thank you.